Good. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session on approaches to scaling up investment in adaptation and resilience, perspectives from business and financial institutions. I'm Ritumetse Molotsane. I'm the head of the Environment and Society at the National Business Initiative in South Africa. So we're a non-for-profit business organization that's focusing on a range of issues, including the environment, and top of mind is climate change in this particular case. I'm joined by an esteemed panel of experts who will be sharing their insights in two separate panels this evening. But in addition to our experts, I think we're also quite fortunate to be joined by additional experts who will be moderating the session. So we've got May Tazin Aung she's the climate finance researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development, and Danielle Boyd, who's the head of strategy implementation from the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. So they'll be helping us through the various conversations that we'll be hosting this evening. Just in terms of setting the scene, I think we can all recognize that climate change, adaptation, and building resilience is a key topic. And I think in the face of the evidence that we have, the need to really increase our efforts towards investment and building up our climate change resilience and adaptation initiatives, I think is quite apparent. The global stocktake is being discussed somewhere else in this venue, and I think that really speaks to that heightened urgency that we need to be seeing in the investment space. So this 1 hour session really brings together perspectives from the various experts who will be with us today, and they're reflecting on adaptation and resilience from their various own experiences, and really focusing on this issue of how do we scale up investment in this critical space, noting the urgency of action that is required. So we will be, I think, quite fortunate to get insights from some of the panelists who've been rethinking their approaches in this space. So really addressing some of the issues around risk, as well as how we understand and manage a variable climate, as well as how we interpret all of this and really package it from an investment perspective. You will be hearing innovative approaches that have been trialed, so we'll be getting some really great insights from practical experience, and I think that will go well for building and scaling up climate resilience and climate adaptation investment going forward. I don't want to take too much time. This is quite a short session and I think really packed, so I'm very happy to hand over to May, who'll be taking us through our first panel.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And can you see me, people online? Okay. Thank you very much for sticking it through to the end of today on the 3rd of December. This is the final session of the day. So you guys, thank you so much all for coming here. So my name is May Tazin Aung, and I'm a climate finance researcher at IED. So let me give you a brief tour of what we're going to do today. We're going to have hot seat panels, so we only have 5 minutes for each speakers, but we will have a chance to hear their pitch of what they're thinking about climate finance and adaptation finance, and then you can hopefully get a chance to understand what they're doing and then get a chance to meet them later. All right, so next slide, please. All right, can I invite Amy Barnes to the stage? She's the head of sustainability and sustainability strategy at Marsh McLennan. Welcome. So this is an old slide, but we have Mansi Shah, who is from the Self-Employed Women's Association of India. Welcome. We also have Dr. Mandy Barnett, who's the Chief Director of Adaptation Policy and Resourcing at the South African National Biodiversity Institute. And we have, last but not least, Mohammed Saeed from the Development Bank of South Africa. Apologies for the awkward seating, Mohammed. We have the strategic pillar that's dividing you. So this is a hot seat panel. So the question for you is, Why is it so hard to finance adaptation, and how are your institutions taking innovative approaches to overcome some of these challenges? So let's start with you, Mohammed.
No, thank you so much, May, and thank you for inviting me. So I'll give you a perspective from a development finance point of view. So we a development infrastructure bank. So we fund infrastructure, predominantly a debt institution. So we don't provide a lot of grant funding, but we can access grants from, climate finance mechanisms. So I think the challenge for DFIs is when it comes to adaptation, historically adaptation, is always seen as being more conducive towards grant funding rather than non-grants. So for a DFI to co-fund these projects becomes quite a challenge. As I said, we can access grant funding from other sources and be able to support adaptation, but it's not a sustainable way of funding adaptation. So from our perspective, we've been looking at innovative ways of funding adaptation where you can crowd in private sector and build a strong business case. So one challenge is, not having a strong business case when it comes to adaptation, as opposed to, let's say, a mitigation project. The other issue is being able to obviously mobilize concessional finance. You need to have a very strong climate argument, climate rationale. So if you want to get funding from the likes of the Green Climate Fund, they want to see all the data around, what's the climate adaptation rationale for this particular project. And very often, developing countries do not have readily available, temperature data, as an example. I think the other issue is around just predicting the outputs from adaptation projects. So to give an example, again, from a infrastructure finance perspective, we want to try and blend ecological infrastructure with grey infrastructure, and I think Mandy might chat more about that. It's easier to fund grey infrastructure because if you're going to spend a couple of $1 million on a water treatment plant, exactly how many megaliters of water you can produce. With ecological infrastructure, when it comes to, for example, catchments, it's very difficult sometimes to quantify those outputs. So as a financial institution, if there's more or greater understanding of those outputs, I believe you would go a long way to kind of try and blend the financing of ecological infrastructure with grey infrastructure. So in terms of some of the solutions we've been looking at DBSA, we've been looking at, in the water sector specifically, looking at water as a new asset class to crowd in private sector. Looking at blended finance solutions where you blend concessional finance from climate mechanisms such as your Green Climate Fund, your GEF, etc., and blend that with DFI, public sector funding, and then provide other sources of de-risking instruments, so guarantees, as an example, subordinated debt. So these are all instruments that you are able to then crowd in private sector. So that's what we've done with a water reuse program in South Africa, where we've got co-funding from the Green Climate Fund to the amount of $235 million. So to date, it's been the largest adaptation investment from the GCF. So we're quite excited about that. So that's been, in a nutshell, our approach. And I think lastly, we feel that a programmatic approach makes a lot of sense when it comes to adaptation, because what we're trying to do is, especially with municipalities in South Africa, to have standardized agreements when it comes to how we fund water reuse infrastructure. So if there's a standard approach, especially under-resourced municipalities that need a lot more technical support and support to do detailed climate vulnerability assessments, once again, to justify the climate adaptation rationale, a programmatic approach, we believe, makes a lot more sense. So you can replicate that and support adaptation at scale.
Thank you very much. And quick jargon check, what is grey infrastructure?
So it's basically hard infrastructure, such as a water reuse treatment plant. So any infrastructure that, and roads, etc. So any infrastructure that could complement, let's say your ecological infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's hop on over quickly to Mandy.
Hi, good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming. I feel a little bit like an imposter because the institution that I'm from is neither a business institution nor a financial institution. However, we are a direct access entity of the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund, and have got quite a lot of experience working in the space of trying to access climate finance. So we work with grant-based finance only, And we focus on locally led adaptation and ecosystem-based adaptation, because the institution I'm from is the South African National Biodiversity Institute. So we're a policy science implementation space. So the challenges, and I think that they're universal. I don't think that our challenges will be different to those in the financial space. I think the one thing is that adaptation is very granular. I think it's very specific to the local context in which it's happening, and it makes it very difficult to scale. So, we can be working with a community in a certain place, but it's very difficult to then say, well, let's replicate that with a few zeros on the end. And what that requires is a lot of investment in process. And we don't have a lot of tolerance from those that are investing in adaptation to put the finances that are needed into the processes to go right to the ground, build capacity, work with communities to understand how they see their vulnerabilities and build it up from there. Secondly, I think that we have weak capacity at all levels across the system to understand adaptation. So there's lots of money up there, and there's lots of needs down there, and there's a very broken system. And we need to really work into all of those deficiencies at the national, sub-national, sort of intermediary community level if we're going to get the funding flowing. And I know that IIED has done a lot of work in getting money to the ground. And the third challenge to just pull out here would be that it's very difficult for local people, but actually business as well, to understand what are the climate projections. So, everyone's expected to be a scientist, and I think we need to really innovate around making tools that are very easy. So in my space, if I do a water project, it's a climate response, whatever the vulnerabilities might be. And I still think there's a very big gap between making the climate science accessible for people that need to mainstream it into what they're doing. So what are we doing? And then the third, of course, thing that everyone will know about is that accessing climate finance is incredibly complicated. So when the GCF was born, we thought it would be very simple, and it's become more and more complicated as we've gone. And there's a long story about how long programming takes. And I think if we were not a public entity that was patient because we're a public entity, I think we would have given up a long time ago, because the complexity, just increases. So what are we doing? We're building a pipeline of LLA, locally led adaptation, and ecosystem-based adaptation projects, working very much with ecological infrastructure. So complementing what Mohammed's saying, we're unlocking the power of biodiversity to help people cope with disasters, water scarcity, and so on, and complementing that with built infrastructure. So that's kind of where we're coming from. We are working in a direct access modality, which is fundamentally about building capacity at the subnational level to do this work in a long-term sustainable way. So making the case that we're not relying on the global north. We don't want to keep relying on consultants. We want to build careers in young people in the countries where they come from to take the action and sustain it in the places where hopefully they will stay. And the last thing I'll say, just in terms of what we're doing, is we're investing quite heavily in governance, so that we make the case for this work at all the different levels of the system and provide examples that show that it is transformative and relevant for the programs of work that our various principles are leading in a country which is plagued with social and economic challenges. And if we don't make the work relevant in that space, it won't be relevant. Thanks, May.
Thank you very much. And I hope you can catch your breath now. So we already have some common themes. We have the climate rationale as one of the challenges. We also have a recommendation for programmatic pipeline programming, sustained programming. So over to you, Mansi. I know you come from quite a different perspective representing women's groups. So what's your perspective on the challenges of adaptation finance?
Thank you so much, May. And I would like to thank all IIED and everyone for inviting me here and giving me an opportunity to represent over 2.5 million poor self-employed women workers from the informal economy, the members of SEWA. The women whom I represent here are come from various trades which we call the informal sector, such as the street vendors, the construction workers, the salt pan workers, agricultural laborers, and so on and so forth. these women, although they contribute immensely to the GDP of any nation, yet their work and themselves as workers are hardly recognized. They are invisible workers. And therefore, when you talk about climate finance, how do you finance the work and workers who are invisible? Right, so that is the biggest challenge that we have in accessing climate finance. Also going a little bit in deep, the issues, and challenges faced by these workers are due to various facets, such as, changing market trends and policies, severe competition, and also these are all then increased many folds by the climate shocks. And in these kind of situations, how do you the workers whom I'm talking about, most of them are below poverty line. So if you have to enable them to adapt to the climate change, which means you have to bring a change in their routine livelihoods, a change in their lives. But these women who are barely able to make two ends meet, how do you help them how do you motivate them to invest in the climate adaptation measures? How do you motivate, incentivize them to adopt these kind of change in their working methods or the technologies and solutions? Also, one of the challenge that we've seen is all the climate adaptation measures, technologies, techniques that are right now available in the market. They are all either very expensive or they are not accessible to the workers whom I am representing here. And therefore, when we are looking at the challenges in adaptation finance, we need to look at two sets of challenges. First is, how do you create awareness and education about impact of climate change? What is climate change? We need to start there. What is its impact? How is it impacting the lives and livelihoods of these workers, and how they can contribute? Because what we have seen is that these workers, because of their intrinsic caring nature, they have always been contributing to climate action. However, what they need is motivation and support to strengthen this climate action. So the first part of climate adaptation finance would go into this, building this awareness, education, and strengthening the climate action, and then enabling the finance. And therefore, just to add one small bit about the program, how we are trying to enable it. So we have initiated, to address the first part, we have initiated a Swachh Akash, a Clean Skies campaign, which helps in creating education and awareness. It helps in enabling affordable access to clean and green energy solutions, and it helps in enabling access to affordable access to climate finance. A finance which brings me to the second part, which is SEWA has piloted innovative innovative financing solution that we call as the Global Climate Resilience Fund. It's a pool of blended finance, which helps in providing the informal sector workers with finance that would help build their resilience and strengthen their climate action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you have some really great talking points, all centered around access, awareness, and affordability. And we'll come back to accountability as a wrap-up in the end. But over to you, Amy, on the challenges of adaptation finance.
Thank you. And I come from a very corporate perspective, but some of the issues are the same. The incentives, there isn't currently any financial detriment to corporates for not being resilient, despite the fact that we've done research that shows following a major event, there's a 17% delta in the valuation recovery from a resilient organisation to a less resilient organisation. That still only shows up post-event. There's no financial pre-event. If I think about the work that we're doing in two ways, closed systems, which I know is a nonsense because there's no such thing, but closed systems and open systems. And if we think about closed systems as being a company's own assets and own operations, we need to make the business case, as you mentioned. So we need to help clients, first of all, understand their vulnerability, the access to the climate data, understand the vulnerability, and then understand the potential of avoided costs if they take action. And it's not just the damage to their assets that may happen, it's also business interruption, and there's also loss of market share. There's some great examples, such as the devastating Thai floods back in 2011. By happy chance, there was one semiconductor manufacturer that was based on a hill, and their market share went from single digits to over 20 digits because they were able to supply the market when others weren't. So there's quite a lot you've got to take into account into the opportunity cost. But one thing we are really good at in insurance is pricing risk. That's what we do for a living, and we are very good at sending that as a signal. So we can calculate both what the vulnerability is and what the return on adaptation investment is. That's for a closed system, which I know isn't closed because assets operate within a wider context. But a lot of the adaptation we've been talking about has been what I'd call open system or societal resilience that we need to focus on. And the really big challenge that we've got there is that the R and the I don't belong to the same person. The person getting the return isn't the person that we're asking to make the investment. And so how do we bring the R and the I together? So one case study that I mentioned earlier today that we're working on with the Milwaukee Sewage District is they have commissioned Ducks Unlimited in the US to restore 4,000 acres of wetland. We know that's going to provide flood defences for the communities downstream. So we're looking to build a community-based insurance product that means that those communities will benefit from the risk reduction. That premium saving, we need to capture some of that premium saving so it can then go to fund the next nature-based solution, because we need to bring the R and the I owners of open systems closer together.
Okay, thank you very much. So the final question for you, and open to any of you to answer, is how can we make sure that there is accountability in the systems within which you work to the most vulnerable climate-affected communities? Would anyone like to take this response?
I don't mind having a stab at that. So I think obviously having a robust reporting framework, is going to be quite key, and having clear targets, which is publicly available. So obviously in our case, as a development finance institution, we need to have, an informed, target around adaptation and mitigation, and then have clear ways of monitoring, are we achieving those targets? So I think that's one way of ensuring there's accountability. But I think the other aspect is around partnerships. I think this is regardless whether it's adaptation or mitigation, partnerships are going to be quite key, and I think partners need to hold themselves accountable. So I think that's going to be another key aspect as well.
And I would say the invisible workers are fundamental to all parts of the economy. If I may give the example of Nespresso, who make the little coffee pods, they recognized their vulnerability to cocoa farmers in Colombia, that if there was a bad harvest, those farmers would have to move to urban areas to feed their families. So working with a company that we founded in 2008, Blue Marble, we have set up a system of micro-insurance. So if there are the wrong climatic conditions when they plant the seeds, or the wrong climatic conditions during the harvest, micro premiums, we're talking about $8 premiums for a payout that allows that farmer to subsist for the year. And Nespresso, that is not philanthropic from Nespresso, that is recognizing the importance of those invisible workers to the supply chain. So I think just more recognition of how dependent we all are, and it's an interconnected system, brings some of that accountability.
Thank you very much. Mandy.
Yeah, maybe just to add one thing, that in addition to adaptation and mitigation, maybe elements of the just transition can also start to make their way into the target. So we start to see, equity and fairness in the way that this happens.
I just wanted to add, Mohammed just touched it briefly in his initial response. And just to add to that having gendered data, that would make a strong case for, accountability. And also what we have seen is that data collection has to be bottom up. It has to be designed, implemented, and carried out by the women themselves. And this kind of data needs to, so there is a need for, again, partnerships with experts in data, in the field of data, as well as multilateral organizations like the World Bank and so on, so that there is a standardized matrix for data collection, so that the data that is generated by these invisible workers about their climate action can align with the global data on climate action, and thereby help in making a strong case for climate finance.
Okay, thank you all for this very rapid fire panel and your ability to speak very fast. So we'll invite the next round of panelists, and to host that session, I'll invite my colleague Danielle to moderate the session.
Hi everyone. They've actually, amazingly, I think if we do two here and two over there. I'll sit down as well, so why don't we have two people over there and then I'll, yeah, excellent. We didn't do a rehearsal, as you can tell. Thanks everyone for joining us, as May said, at the end of the day. I appreciate you coming over. My name is Danielle Boyd. I'm from the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, which is a membership body for the investment community. So that's primarily asset managers, asset owners such as pension funds, to collaborate on climate change. And a lot of the work that we've been doing, we're guilty of doing a lot of work on net zero. We started two of the net zero alliances within GFANZ, but we've also been working with investors for the last few years on helping them understand physical climate impacts, how they impact their investment portfolios, and how they can kind of start to think about responding and managing risk. But it has taken traditionally a risk focus, and that's partly because of things like TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and ISSB and others. But we've also been asking ourselves a question of how investment community and other financial institutions can contribute to the adaptation resilience goals of the Paris Agreement. So I'm really pleased. We've got an excellent panel, not a lot of time, but let me introduce everyone. We've got Amal Lee Amin Managing Director of Climate, Diversity and Advisory at British International Investment, BAI. We've got Faith Ward, who is Chief Responsible Investment Officer at Brunel Pension Partnership and also the Chair of IRGCC. We've got Rachel Delays, Head of Sustainability at Convex Insurance, and Amit Puri, Global Head of Sustainable Finance at Standard Chartered. So who do we have? We have primarily private finance institutions here, and also a DFI, development finance institution. So it's potentially some slightly different perspectives that you might get in a normal conversation on adaptation and resilience, and potentially kind of new players to the field. So with that, I'm going to ask the first question and perhaps try and do a quicker round of the first question, which is, given the lots of different perspectives, that you might hear in public, especially public versus private sectors, how do you view, either from your organization perspective or your kind of broader industry perspective, how do you view your kind of role in adaptation and resilience?
Hello. Great, thanks. Just briefly, so we're the UK's DFI, and just to explain, we're actually the oldest DFI. We're 75 years old this year. We used to be known as CDC, but we're now called British International Investment. And we're sort of maybe a bit different to many DFIs because we are primarily an equity investor. 75% of our portfolio is equity. And I think that's quite important when we think about how we view climate adaptation, how we invest in adaptation and resiliency. So first of all, we have a climate strategy. It's based around our interpretation of Paris alignment. We have 3 blocks: to be net zero by 2050, to invest in a way that supports a just transition, and that was in early 2020 before everyone was talking about just transition. Clearly a very, very important part of the social economic development challenge that needs to come alongside particularly decarbonisation, but also critically adaptation, where certain sectors may become less viable. And then the third pillar is adaptation resilience. And broadly speaking, we have a 2-pronged approach. We invest to adapt, and that means really working with our investees to enable them to be adapted and resilient. A lot of capacity building in some cases that we provide through technical assistance. And then we also are investing in companies that can enable adaptation of key sectors, particularly agriculture, water, etc. Maybe I'll stop there, and then I can say a bit more about those afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amali. I think that leads nicely on to Faith.
No, absolutely. So thinking about it from a sort of risk and opportunity, which is what investors were there to do. So looking at and having those conversations with the assets in which we invest in terms of their vulnerability, but also their adaptive capacity in terms of climate change. I think one of the challenges we face, though, is I think that we've talked about free rider problems in many areas of sustainability. This is really difficult in adaptation because everybody just thinks, well, if I'm all right over here, even the semiconductor example, if they're all right at the top of the hill, I probably invested as a universal owner in a whole host of different things. So to think about it systemically is really important for an investor, particularly like pension funds who invested globally in all sorts of supply chains, and to really kind of sort of bring that out really into those discussions. Obviously, there's the opportunity set. It's a little bit more complicated because it's quite hard sometimes to distinguish. Somebody says, oh, what you invested in adaptation? I go, oh. And it's like sometimes it's more about kind of building it into design. So thinking about it in terms of the real estate portfolio or the infrastructure, or even products, how they can be more. So it may essentially not be any different in terms of that, but they've thought about it in terms of product design. So sometimes it's quite hard to grasp the adaptation component of perhaps something else, which makes it, whereas when something is like a piece of technology that reduces carbon, it's a bit easier to go, oh, point at that and put a number on it and go, and that's how many millions and billions I've spent on decarbonisation. It can be, climate adaptation is just that little bit more complicated, but because it's complicated, doesn't mean we shouldn't tackle it because it's too important to leave out. So I'll hand over the baton.
Is this on? Yeah. So I work for an insurer and reinsurer, which does big commercial insurance, and the commercial insurers clearly are very affected by catastrophe insurance. The problem with insurance is that there isn't enough of it. Of the 300 billion of economic losses roughly every year, there's only about a third of them, only about 100 billion are insured. So what we need to do is really, really expand that penetration of insurance, both in the geographies, like even in Europe and the US, there is not nearly as much insurance bought as should be. And then there's hardly any, there's sort of 1% penetration in some African countries of insurance. So that need is just going to escalate as we as global warming increases. And with greater insurance, not only does it bring more economic prosperity to countries, it helps businesses and farmers. It helps improve risk management. So the way in which you can help that penetration of insurance is, as Amy suggested earlier, microinsurance, the ways in which there are financial institutions looking to develop microinsurance, and the Insurance Development Forum is an insurance-led organization, which has also got the World Bank associated with it. So they have been doing a lot of work in trying to develop that. It can also be done at government level, and at government level, the tools and products that can be used to help expand and scale the amount of insurance that you can get for a government is something called a parametric. So you have an insurance policy that is triggered by an earthquake of a certain amount on a certain level on the Richter scale, or a hurricane. So these are because these are very binary. They can also be expanded to include the financial markets. You can get sort of investors coming in because it's a sort of black or white. Does it happen? Does it not? And there was a great example recently of the Moroccan government who, after they had last year bought a catastrophe bond for 250 million. And when the earthquake happened in July, within 10 days, they were paid like that. So it was a great example of how, for 1% premium, whatever they paid for it, that they could get this. So I think insurers need to work with the rest of the financial industry to help really expand that. But I would say, don't lose sight themselves of not running away from catastrophe risk as things are getting trickier, and really trying to understand what are bigger changes because of urbanization or other reasons, and what is climate change? And that's a tricky thing to evaluate, but we have models, catastrophe models, that help us do that, and we need to expand that further, I think.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks for bringing in some real-life examples. we're now fighting with the receptions next door.
Yeah,
So
sounds fun over there.
We'll
doesn't
let
it?
you all go and gate crash that very shortly, but please speak up.
Just very quickly from my side then, from Standard Chartered. So Standard Chartered is a UK headquartered bank, but predominantly operates in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And the reason I mention that is, we know that some of the worst impacts of climate change are going to be felt in emerging markets. So predominantly the footprint markets in which Standard Chartered operates in. Risk and opportunity was mentioned. Our focus on adaptation and resilience really did start from a risk management exercise, as is often the case. Regulatory driven, looking at the physical risk that some of the assets that we finance are exposed to, and figuring out if we have to take a haircut from a capital perspective on them. I mean, we'd like to think we're altruistic, but it often starts from a regulation, and that's really where it started from. But that was a couple of years ago. If you fast forward to where we are now, we've just proudly co-authored a report with the UNDRR and KPMG, a guide for adaptation and resilience. And it goes to the point that was being made earlier on about people don't quite know what we mean by adaptation and resilience. So having a taxonomy of sorts is helpful to attract capital. So we can use that. We do intend to use that with different capital providers, whether that's a DFI, whether that's an asset manager, or that's an insurance company, to say these are the types of things that we need to do. From Standard Chartered's perspective, last point, it's existential. I mean, we operate in these markets. When a third of Pakistan was flooded, that has a real impact on our communities that we operate in, our business that we run in the country as well, and that is likely to happen again and again. So it is raced up to the top of the agenda for us in the last 18 months or so.
Great, thanks, Amit. And I would recommend that report that you released today. Yeah, hot off the press. So I'm already hearing, quite a few potential solutions and quite a diverse range of ways that private finance institutions and public finance can support adaptation, and perhaps ways that weren't thought about necessarily a couple of years ago. So my next question is really going to be around any breakthroughs that you've had, whether that's an investment, but also just a change in the way of thinking, some step forwards that you've made. Amali, you're raring to go.
I'm raring to go, yeah. So I mentioned that we invest to adapt, and largely that's particularly important in infrastructure. And last year we entered into a joint venture with Matito Water Utilities, actually a UAE-based water company. We've established now, we put equity investment into that platform to create the Africa Water Investment Development Platform. And the first investment the platform has made is in Rwanda, bulk surface wastewater treatment to provide, I think it's something like 25% of Kigali's potable water. So a very significant asset. And as part of that, enabling and working with Matito to help build both the platform's expertise around adaptation, and then as we invest in those assets to ensure that we can support them, that they're also adapted. So that is an example of that invest to adapt. On the other end of the spectrum, and there we're talking about relatively big, large-scale investments. At the other end of the spectrum, an investment we made earlier this year, really small scale, 2 million in a very innovative company in Kenya providing solar drip irrigation to farmers. Farmers are earning less than $3 a day. Provide them with helping to reduce the upfront cost of that solar drip irrigation to really help build their resiliency to increasing drought. Obviously that brings a mitigation component too, and actually part of the longer term sustainability of that company is to actually try and attract carbon credits as well. So really interesting, very innovative, small scale but highly impactful. But what this has also led us to conclude, and I think it very much gets back to the point that Faith made about the need to think about this systemically. And as a DFI, we are starting to believe and recognize that if we're really going to be able to scale our investment, and globally we really scale the necessary investment to really deliver adaptation at the scale that is needed, we do need to see a much more systemic thinking. And I gave those two examples: water supply infrastructure, and then these technologies that are much more about sort of almost demand side, reducing the use of water. These are all equally important when you think of the system. It's not just putting more water in, but it's actually much more effective use of water. And that sort of systemic thinking, I think, is really quite urgently needed.
Thanks, Emily. And I think the distinction you made, well, it's two really interesting examples of investments, but also the way that you're thinking about, so the kind of incremental investment to adaptive capacity and the more kind of pure play, I guess, adaptation solutions, as you might call them. So you mentioned systemic thinking. Faith, you mentioned that you're a kind of universal owner. So how have you maybe started thinking about this? I know it's a challenge, but examples.
So I think we are, it feels like as an investment community that we are still at the beginning of trying to get our act together on this one, and very much looking to the likes of IGCC to help, because it is complicated, so we do need that help and support, and any kind of reports and things that bring it to life and examples, I think that really all helps. So we've been doing it, we've been asking our sort of, but you start with the real assets, you start with your real estate, you start with your infrastructure, because it's kind of really obvious. So you start with those asset managers about how they're thinking about it. We've been doing that for a number of years, and they've now got plans around a lot of the assets. They can articulate quite clearly, you know, which ones are vulnerable, what they're doing about it, what the plan of action is, and so that's very encouraging. Where we felt there was quite a gap was around the corporate engagement. You know, often you talk to a lot of the corporates around decarbonisation, but there wasn't the same conversation happening on physical risk, and we're trying to elevate that with our asset managers. We're 100% outsourced at Brunel, but we're finding that just we weren't getting, basically wasn't happening good enough for us, being quite passionate, funnily enough, about this topic. So what we've chosen to do, we don't actually do, we have over like 3,500 positions, sorry, hopefully, okay. I shall carry on whilst Danielle gets some water there. We've got thousands of companies, but we've chosen to engage with 20 consumer staples companies, because we've chosen those companies because we know that intrinsically physical climate resilience is fundamental to their business model, but also we've chosen companies which we know could, in stimulating this conversation, have a direct impact. So they don't have perhaps the ability just to switch out. Actually, they actually have intrinsic, you know, on the ground kind of part of their sort of their business model. So we've only just started the process, but the idea is we've been using the work of the IGCC and others to define a framework to evaluate these companies. We'll start engaging. It's a 2-year project, and the idea is then to share some of that learning with other investors so that we can build that capacity and knowledge. So I think we're still at that stage of just trying to build, where do you start these conversations on something that is, you know, that bit more complicated. But, you know, we saw a gap, and we thought, no, let's just get it stuck in there ourselves, and actually try and take this issue forward.
Testing, yeah. I appreciate both the honesty about how difficult this is, but also that you just thought, you know what, we need to do something. So.
Hello? No, that on that one.
Is it working? Yes. Great.
Yes.
We might do a
Yes.
bloopers outtake of this panel session. But you mentioned you need to start somewhere. Actually, for the private finance sector, it kind of started with insurance, didn't it? In a way, with the risk modelling, this kind of I think the more advanced industry within the broader private finance sector. So I'm going to go over to you, Rachel.
Yes, that's true, and that's one thing that certainly the rest of the financial world, I think, is now identifying that the insurance world has been using these climate catastrophe models for a while, and if that can be expanded. In fact, there is the Insurance Development Forum that I mentioned earlier, has sort of with others created something called the Global Risk Modelling Alliance, and that basically is enabling data and gathering that data together and put a modelling infrastructure for the V20 countries to help enable the kind of parametric, the insurance solutions that I was talking about earlier. But I would just say very quickly, on as far as impact and as far as investments concerned, or transition in your business sectors, what I always try and communicate in my firm is lean in and try and understand, and the opportunities will come. You know, we became a member of something called Fly Green Alliance, Fly Green Alliance, which is about sustainable aviation, and through that and through learning, we are an aviation insurer, but we're now backing an electric vehicle lift-off and take-off specific insurer from next year. So, and just through leaning and trying to understand, these things are prevalent with lots of risk, but the more you lean in, you can understand.
Would you like me to build on that?
Yeah, please go ahead. We're actually quite good for time, so no need to rush.
Just more bloopers then. So just building on what Rachel was saying, so parametric insurance is something that we've sort of lent lines of credit to recently. I think from Standard Chartered's perspective, I think the financial services sector more generally from the banking perspective, we are not as advanced as we need to be. So in terms of breakthroughs, we just don't have them. So what have we done though? We're trying to raise the profile that adaptation resilience has when it comes to a type of asset class that we should be financing. And one of the things we did was to commission a report that said that for every dollar of capital invested in adaptation or resilience now, you avoid $12 of impact in the future. So, but how do you monetize that? How do you actually, lend to an asset that is going to protect something well in the horizon or well in the future? That is outside of the way banks normally think about deployment of capital when it comes to large infrastructure projects. So I think the partnership piece is very important here. And, you've got 4 different actors here from the financial community. The 4 of us all need to work together effectively, plus others, to figure out, okay, well, how do we deploy capital at scale? How do you de-risk Standard Chartered? How do we make sure that we're insured? How do we make sure that institutional investors get capital is going towards the right kind of asset class? And it is burgeoning, and it's, I think things like guides, and it's not just because we wrote it. I think often you just write something down and it helps people focus their attention in terms of what do you actually mean by this particular asset class. But that to me is where we really, really need to focus. Just get capital deployed at a much faster pace, but it's not going to happen independently of us doing it in the banking sector. It's going to have to be everybody across here.
Thanks. I think, Lisa, because you're already talking about partnerships, and I think a few of you have already mentioned kind of collaborations or initiatives that you've been involved in along the way at some point. So the next question is, hopefully we're going to expand our efforts even more in 2024 on adaptation resilience. So if you could call on any group of actors, institutions to collaborate in 2024, who would it be and what would you be asking them to do?
Great. Well, actually, we launched a collaborative at the end of 2020, the Adaptation Resilience Investors Collaborative. It's primarily DFIs, but we have some MDBs, we have some bilateral development banks, including multilateral development banks. And we've been working very closely with a lot of impact investors as well, similar to ourselves, but sort of private as opposed to publicly funded. And we've been progressing in 3 main areas. One on investor relevant metrics, because I think it's pretty clear that adaptation finance as an input, as when we talk here about the doubling of adaptation finance in the UNFCCC, that's looking at finance as an input metric and really obviously one would assume and hope that that does have bearing on the outcomes and impact, but it's not really easy for an investor to necessarily factor that in. So we've been working with a number of other initiatives. In fact, I'll be talking on a panel tomorrow about that with UNEP-FI, who are now the secretariat for this collaborative. The other is on how we develop more common tools around physical climate risk assessment so that we start to standardize, because we all pretty much have different tools. There's some common good practice, more or less, but we need to standardize those. And the other is how do we really move to scale? And I think what I hope to see in 2024, because of our partnership with UNEP-FI as the Secretariat, they're also working with their the principal and responsible banking to also develop. We're going to be co-developing guidance and toolkits for financial institutions so that they can start to, particularly in the countries where we invest in, Africa and Asia, can start to build their capacity to do more on adaptation resilience. It feels a little bit like where we were on energy efficiency maybe 15, 20 years ago. We need to think a bit differently in terms of the financing, but also critically build capacity. And we probably will need concessional funding also to come in alongside, at least in these early days.
I'll let you plug the event. When can everyone listen to you?
Well, I'm speaking at least 3 events in the next 2 or 3 days, but no, the one tomorrow morning, I'm speaking the adaptation finance gap. So UNEP always produce the finance gap. So at 10:30 tomorrow morning in the UNEP Pavilion, they'll be presenting the adaptation finance gap report, and I'm on a panel providing some comments. There's also an event which Lena, we're on an. Oh no, that's the same. Lena's also on the event. Sorry, there's another one on Wednesday in the Sustainable Finance in the Innovation Hub, but I won't plug that one here for now.
And maybe I'll go over to Amit, because Standard Chartered we're also involved in the Principle for Responsible Banking. So there's already been a collaboration. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I was thinking would be interesting to mention here is, as Marley said, this asset class is maybe 10, 15 years behind some of the others, but we have to also avoid some of the mistakes that we made in deploying capital. So, the report that we published talks a lot about maladaptation as well, so just not doing stuff for the sake of it, but making sure that it has, a lasting benefit and also does no significant harm as well. So I think to me that's a really important issue that we need to keep top of mind as we deploy capital at scale, that we don't just do it because we're so excited about doing it, because we're actually doing it and it has an enduring benefit as well. So ensuring there's no maladaptation. It was already mentioned about blended finance. I mean, I think commercial banks are going to really struggle to lend at scale to infrastructure, to resilience projects, adaptation projects. So blended finance is going to have to be the main tool that we use. So using World Bank, concessional capital, DFIs, etc. Is going to be absolutely crucial. So I think there's a few things that we know that we've not done well enough in deployment for climate mitigation finance, and so I think we should take lessons from there for climate adaptation, just make sure we don't repeat those mistakes again.
Excellent, thank you, Amit. And there's a bit of a call for a collaboration, I guess, there on the blended finance point, which requires, I think, private and public sector to be speaking the same language, which I'm not sure is quite being done. I'm sure these frameworks will help, but Faith, maybe perhaps over to you on the collaboration point.
Yeah, so it sounds as if there's going to be quite a lot coming out in the next few days, because I was just checking that in terms of the announcement that's coming out in terms of collaboration you've been doing with, say, with the Insurance Development Forum. So this is work that IGCC has been doing more broadly with the Climate Champions and the UNEP FI again, in terms of, so I think what that tells you is A, that we're all working together, and B, there's going to be an awful lot coming out, even if it's in the next few days, that we're just gradually cranking up in terms of that sort of knowledge building that we need to share, and also recognising that it is about bringing everybody together. One of the other areas I'm involved in the UK is the Transition Plan Task Force, and I co-chair a work stream on adaptation, and it's about trying to bring and elevate, if you like, that discussion alongside the decarbonisation elements in terms of corporate disclosures. And there will be some sort of dedicated outputs around adaptation, hopefully in Q1 next year again. And again, that's bringing together academics, it's bringing together people from finance, people from banking, people from all sorts of different areas to bring their expertise to bear to kind of what is the guidance that we need to be putting out there to the sector to make progress. I think pulling the strings together, I think you talked about sort of blended finance, because it's going to be difficult to lend to it. I think we've got to change, although that might well be the solution. I think we've got to kind of go up a level. To me, it's about adaptation matters. We need to, taking action should be rewarded, and we need to find better ways of sending that message to corporates, assets and projects that this actually matters, and it's part of the valuation. And we haven't cracked, I don't know how to crack the problem, but I think until we actually, even that $1 still has to be the $1, even if we know that it will bank $12 in the future. Trying to get them to do that today is still really hard. But we've got to change the narrative about the fact, and whether that's through accounting rules or other things, we've got to change it, which is just very frustrating, but we'll get there.
Can I ask a question sort of related to that, because this came up in a panel the other day, but particularly maybe to Rachel from the insurance sector. What about avoided costs, or avoided maybe reduced premiums on insurance? How, because it feels that we need to get there. And when I talked about similar to energy efficiency, obviously that avoided use of oil, gas, whatever fuel, which is now incentivized when banks provide loans for energy efficiency, whether it's appliances, houses, etc. We're starting to see more of that. Are you starting to see that at all? Is it something the insurance sector might help drive forward, these avoided costs, and then reduce premiums as well?
I think that is specifically no, other than obviously declaring and this sort of transparency of it is increasing, and the standards that people are respecting that and reporting against that way. But I think that will almost certainly naturally come, because the more that if you are, if you're renewable energy, you will receive more, we will get more capital, we will more easily get capital. And our capital as insurers comes from your investment capital, it comes from reinsurance, it comes from a number of sources. And that capital, will I think will follow that it will be more difficult for that to come if for the fossil fuel world. So I think that's how that will come through, in terms of that, and that there will eventually be a cost associated with that. Direct benefits. There are some, I've seen some things, for example, giving increased capacity, so having more capital and capacity for businesses, sectors that meet certain criteria. We probably will see more of that. If there could be an allowance, it's a very difficult thing to say, isn't it? Because there's so many factors that go into what premium costs are. But if they are, I think
a bit like if you have a burglar alarm, or you've got windows that are with bars on, that your
for sure. Sorry, if you are mitigating that if you're mitigating the risk, then absolutely that should be reflected, because it's just another information point. So and the insurance industry can be helpful towards what that can look like. So absolutely, but it's not happening yet, do you think, or is it starting to happen? Certainly from what I hear on that, we're not a sort of house and car insurer, but it is happening in the more domestic insurance world. Yes, so I think that will come, and as insurers will want to incentivize more. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see more more obvious benefits for if you are meeting certain environmental criteria.
Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up this panel. Thank you all so much. You were wonderfully brief and concise, yet insightful. So really appreciate that. And I'm going to hand over to Rita Metze to close the session. I think maybe we'll just stay.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks for, I think, the most invigorating session that I've been in all day. I really did enjoy it. Thank you very much for your participation, both those who were part of the audience, but also the members of the various panels that we had today. I've learned a lot. I'm building on what May shared with us earlier. So she said, in terms of what needs to be done, or at least the focus areas, looking at access, awareness, affordability, and accountability. I would add to that one more A, and that's really agency, in terms of some of the the insights and the comments that were shared. And then the last one, I think, which really came out of this panel for me, was that there's a lot of information, there's a lot of awareness also of where we are and where we need to go, and just the agility that can translate that into the investments that we need to see in climate change adaptation. With that, I'd like to thank you for a really fantastic session. I loved it. I hope you enjoyed it. And we're happy to release you to go and gate crash the cocktail next door.